Hi everyone, this is Michael introducing Project Hindsight Labs. This is an event series that we're running, essentially to bring to a larger audience such a concept as applied history or useful history. I founded this organization many years ago now, and it's become very busy, if that's the word, and it's going very well. And it's been a great opportunity, a great moment to link to others who are doing similar work and to spread the word further. So it's a great opportunity to connect people and to provide a platform for discussion and further dissemination. Today we've got Dr. Duncan Money. Say hi, Duncan.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending where you are. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks. So Duncan, as I've been mentioning in the advertising materials, is a wonderful person to be joining us today with such adaptability and development of opportunity, and I think that's what most of us will be here for today. So very brief biography. Duncan did his PhD in history at Oxford, taught in the UK and in the Netherlands, and has now branched off into a full-time role as a researcher in African mining, but has now also moved to work in several other countries as well, and I'm sure he'll tell us about that. So what we'll probably do is go through, we've got a few set questions, we'll have a discussion, and then use the rest of the time for a Q&A. Sound good? Good. Okay. So Duncan, without further ado, how would you describe what you're doing in the world of history, and what are its goals, sort of textures, problems to solve? Paint us a picture. Thank you.
So, most of my research revolves broadly around the mining industry. That was the kind of history I was researching previously, and that's the kind of history I continue to do now. And this has various different aspects that people are interested in. There's a very rich social history about this. It's also the financial side of the industry, and what is particularly interesting for many people that the industry has cyclical booms and busts, and so generally speaking, people are interested, if they come to me, in one of two things, which is what has happened to this thing in the past, or what has happened in or to this place in the past. The thing tending to be a commodity, and the place and the place tending to be mine sites, mining community, region, and so on. And then sometimes as well, what happened to this person in the past, particular individuals associated with the industry, and what their role was, their story was, and so on.
Thanks, Duncan. So you mentioned why you got started in this because it directly related to your academic research, and of course you've written many studies and a wonderful book on the history of copper. So I mean, I think what people are really here to hear about is, the really specific case studies, how you get out there and make a success of this kind of initiative. So just to paint us a picture for this, what is your greatest success story so far?
Good question. I think there's several ways of looking at this. One in terms of kind of a broad contribution that I'm pleased that I made, or was able to contribute to, is I've been involved in digitizing uh, endangered archives, which will then hopefully makes these records more accessible, and then preserves them to an extent for future use, and to make those records uh, more accessible is something that I feel very professionally proud of. Particularly, I worked with the Mine Workers Union of Zambia for some time to make their records available, and then other similar projects. Uh, in terms of that's more kind of a perhaps personal contribution to the historical discipline kind of thing. Uh, I also I worked with a client for some years, who were looking at the history of their company, because it's very easy, I find, to, if you have a particular knowledge and training on something, to overestimate what other people know about a subject. Um, and many companies, institutions, and so on have been around a while, or even those that haven't been around for very long at all, don't have much information about their own history. And so I worked with an institution which had been relatively recently founded, well, within the last 40 years. So recent by a historian's definition. Uh, and to look at their history. And then finally, I think just as on a more personal perspective, I feel my greatest success at a personal level is that I get to do a job that I enjoy. I like doing it, and it's something I was trained in. It's something I like, and yeah, this brings me great personal satisfaction and sometimes even happiness.
Thanks, Duncan. That's exactly the kind of things I think people are hoping to hear. It goes off our set questions slightly, but I think what would be a useful thing for people to hear about is the kind of, a day in the life or a week in the life of you, because I know you travel a lot for your work to many countries, even continents. So could you give us a sort of sense of your workflow, your tasks, who you work with, that kind of thing?
So my work tends to be then very varied. And I mean, I like this. One thing I enjoy a lot about my work is that I have the ability to plan my own time and schedule and the work I do more or less as I see fit, which is a big bonus for me. But obviously, that's not something that everybody enjoys. And so this does mean there is kind of an element of unpredictability in what I do. So in terms of a week-to-week schedule, it varies greatly. If I'm somewhere working on a project, perhaps I will then do the 3 or 4 days archive work, or I will interview somebody, or look through digitized material or material that I've previously gathered from doing research on this topic for now well over a decade. The kind of normal tasks you would associate with historical research, but then it can also involve very different things. Uh, well, not only going to very different places, sometimes at quite short notice. Uh, it could also involve doing lots of discussions to try and find out what exactly people are interested in. Sometimes when people come to me, they are after some very specific information, but other times they're not, and they don't quite know what exactly they're looking for, and they know their company has done something in the past or their institution, but they're not exactly sure what it is or where the information is or how best to find this. So I do a lot of those kind of discussions.
Thanks, Duncan. It resonates perfectly with the first ever consultancy historical work I did was in law. And it was a classic example of the client has something important on their desk, but they have no idea of how to grapple with it. And neither does any of the people within their organization at all, despite employing thousands of people. And it's been, it provided me with an insight as perhaps it's a structural issue across many industries, many countries. And so I'm glad to hear you've had similar experiences. Duncan, again, it's diverging slightly from what we were going to look at the questions, but I think again people would like to hear. Many people, including me, are employed in organizations that employ thousands of people. So how does it feel? You're kind of a freelance. If that, I don't know what kind of organizational structure you have, if any. How does it feel working like this with often very short deadlines? I also know from my own experience. How do you kind of adapt to it? How have you coped with it? Do you enjoy working more autonomously like this?
I do, but I work collaboratively with a lot of people. A lot of the projects I do myself. Specialist expertise in a particular area of history, mostly related to the mining industry, Southern Africa, and a few other places. Uh, but so I also work collaboratively with people I've known for some time, people I meet professionally. But also importantly, there are projects that I can only take on a part of. I have there are certain things I can do. I know how to do, but there are history is a very wide and diverse subject. The terrain of the past is vast, and I think beyond the knowledge of any one individual, or certainly beyond my knowledge. Uh, it's very useful then to collaborate with other historians and also with people from related disciplines. Industrial archaeology, for example, is probably the classic one for the mining industry, but other disciplines too. You need to. Well, I find it useful to learn to collaborate with people and just be very clear in each other with what the expectations are, because obviously if when you're working outside a formal institutional structure, then you need to be clear with each other about what your responsibilities are and so on, because ultimately it's down to you.
Thanks, Duncan. Yes, yeah, the actor being very proactive and having to take on everything. So you're your own HR department, your own legal department, your own accountant, your own travel planning, and all these kinds of things, which can be liberating. And millions of people do this for their jobs every day. So it's achievable. Yeah. So glad to hear you're doing it so well. I think you've written some publications on the particular research challenges largely in Africa, but I've heard these points from example, the Caribbean or India about resource challenges, digital technology in remote locations, as mines usually are. And I wonder if you could just talk us through any particularly interesting aspects of that our audience might enjoy. Thank you.
Yeah, I try and well, I thought about trying to write more about the practical sides of doing things, and the project I mentioned earlier with the Mine Workers Union of Zambia. I wrote an article trying to reflect on some of the practical issues there, and challenges of doing digitization, because often digitization, sometimes I'm guilty of this myself, is seen as a kind of a panacea for preserving records and accessing them and so on. And there are issues with that which don't need to discuss at great length here. But things like people might think of access to power, that your equipment gets full of dust. People, the buildings you are working in might flood. Bits of the roof might cave in. I mean, all of these things are stuff that happen in the Mine Workers Union project, and by no means limited to Southern Africa. I've been to archives in the UK which were really in a terrible, lamentable state, and which would not have been particularly good places to work, and would have been very difficult to digitize. I think just thinking a bit more about publications. I mean, I would say the one downside about the work I do now is that I'm not always able to publish what I write about. You're writing for somebody who is paying for it, and they are not writing to allow you to distribute it in many instances. Sometimes they publish it themselves, which is very nice, but a lot of times they don't, and that limits the kinds of information you can provide, which sometimes I find it a little bit difficult and a bit restrictive. But everything comes with positives and negatives.
Thanks. We actually had a related question on sources from James Ransom of Open Impact, another kind of academic spin-off organization. And he asked about the types of sources that are privileged by the historical record, right? This is well known to historians. Written archives make particular sense in certain cultures, but say oral traditions, for example, in others. But of course, the kind of work we're talking about is largely paper-based, maybe digitized bits of paper. How do you grapple with any oral traditions, for instance, in the course of your work, especially in areas where that's particularly important culturally?
I've done a lot of interviews with people, and generally, as you say, these I find these very useful. These kind of interviews useful for finding out work practices, which was a lot of what my research was about before. What are work practices like? How do people do their jobs? And something I still do a bit of research into now. And even in industries that are workplaces that are very heavily regulated, a lot of this is just tacit knowledge. There's the way that stuff is written down. This is how we do things in this particular place. But then when you talk to people, you quite quickly realize, oh yes, that's how it's written down. But that's actually we do this, this, and this, or this is how we used to do it, and that kind of information is then not codified into texts and sometimes accessible through interviews and sometimes through longer oral traditions. But I should say most historical research I do is fairly recent. By some people's criteria, hardly a historian at all. I rarely go back before 1830. And more commonly in the 20th century. So that shapes the source base which I use for my work. If you are doing research in Southern Africa on an earlier period, then the kind of material you use as your primary sources accordingly changes.
Thanks, Duncan. How interesting. I've got another one. Are there any, before we go to the Q&A, which we'll do in a minute, are there any particular trends that are coming up that you think will impact your work, lead to more developments? They could be political stuff in commodities, sustainability technology, which is heavily reliant on these kind of metals you're talking about. I mean, what's top of your radar for coming up, for scoping for new projects?
So for me, with the mining industry, there's a huge interest and demand for copper at the moment, which is kind of lucky for me that when I went into doing freelance work, there was, in fact, a major boom in the topic which I had studied for several years. Had I written my PhD on the history of fish and so on, then might have found things a bit more challenging. But yeah, there's a major boom for metals related to demand for technologies to mitigate climate change and to produce electric vehicles, and that underpins a lot of my work. That's why a lot of people come to me. Secondly, there is a greater interest in institutions about their own past and histories, some of which are related to involvement with colonialism, but not always. And again, those are tasks which historians are well suited to assist with. So I've also done some work with institutions which had their origins in the mining industry, but are now very far removed from that. And so consequently, I should say, they don't know very much about it. There are broader trends, I think, as well, in terms of practical stuff, the amount of material that's available digitally, how you search that, how to try and make sense of what is sometimes seems a kind of overwhelming volume of stuff. And I'm not sure what to do about that.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I mean, the other trend I've noticed in this kind of thing is mergers and acquisitions, and globally as well. I mean, when an Australian company takes over a Japanese one, do the Japanese source it where would they keep them in Japan? Do they take them to Australia? Usually neither. They throw them away, unfortunately. So, and with an increasing trend towards M&A amongst bigger companies, I mean, I think, as you say, there's both kind of a cultural heritage interest in the history of many organizations, but also for practical reasons, because people are finding them malfunctioning in certain tasks, and that's something I've been contributing a lot to myself. Everyone, thanks for being so patient. We'd like to open for some questions now for 5 or so minutes. Does anyone have any?
I find this usually happens, Michael. I can address a subject so comprehensively that there's rarely something from the audience.
We do have a question there. I'm not sure the person's name though. So yeah, go ahead.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Hi, Duncan. Good to see you again. It's not so much a question, it's more a comment. Duncan was talking about archives which become accessible and archives that disappear, as it were. In the South African context, certain archives suddenly become very important again. The Consolidated Diamond Mines archives in Kimberley are unfortunately closed to researchers, and I've been trying there for a number of years to try and get into these archives. Has never worked. Then the Jagersfontein Slimes Dam collapse happened, and suddenly these archives became extremely important, and now they've all disappeared off to Johannesburg, fairly certain to prevent claims. The same with the Anglo-American archives with regard to Broken Hill Kabwe. Perhaps you could just comment on this a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I did, without wanting to be too specific, I did some work on the Kabwe issue, which is a former mine site which is now heavily polluted and was the subject of major litigation in the last couple of years. Yeah, the disappearance of archives and they're being rendered inaccessible to prevent claims being made is a huge problem, and it's very hard to know what to do about this, except to kind of gather material when and where you can, and keep it in other places, which also has different ethical issues. And Mike, I think we've got a question in the chat as well.
You do. It says, we mentioned the freedoms of this kind of freelance work, but could you say anything about challenges of this as a historian, particularly everyday access to institutional repositories, i.e., if I may decode the question, are you taken as seriously as if you had a fancy email address and therefore given access to stuff equally? Thank you.
That's a very good question. There are difficulties accessing material which previously I had ready access. I used to work for universities, and some of the universities had great access to stuff. Obviously, not every university I worked with had access to stuff, and no longer having access to that is difficult. Partly, I learned that if I need to get access to something, I put in a project budget. That if I need to get access to something, I know it's going to be a big part of a project, I put it as a budget line. But obviously, you can't do that for every project, and you can't know in advance always what material you will need. So that does occasionally pose difficulties. A lot of the time, for secondary literature, which is hard to get access to, I just contact people, usually the author, and most people seem quite nice, and that you can that are happy that someone wants to read their work and will help. And I like to think I always do the same. If somebody ever contacts me wanting academic work that I've published, I'm always happy to share it. But yeah, that is it's not all milk, honey, and sunshine and happiness and so on.
Can I ask a related practical question? I mean, you don't need to reveal like personal details, but presumably some of these things revolve around citizenship, the ability to get certain visas, which depends on where you're traveling from and so on. So, I mean, I wonder if you could say anything about that people could extrapolate to their own circumstances.
Yeah, I have. I mean, now I spend a lot more time applying for work visas than I ever thought I would in my life when I was younger. But I do that from a position of privilege because I'm a British passport holder. So I mentioned I travel a lot for work, and I work sometimes at relatively short notice. But that is not simply an option for everyone. And obviously there are different ways of being an independent historian and working freelance. Not particularly with the increase in access to digital materials. So it's not necessarily that you have to be kind of up and off and go and work in different countries, but for certain projects you do, and so the kind of the passport you hold in your own personal circumstances, caring responsibilities, and so on, shape the kind of work you can do. And I think it's kind of particularly ludicrous that I, as a British national, get easier access to many countries on the African continent than many people holding the passports of various African countries do themselves. Not to mention being able to travel still in the European Union and elsewhere in the world.
Thanks, Duncan. Very some great points to think about there. Anyone got any further points? So I've got a final question. Oh, Luca Romelli has a question.
Yes, thank you for your talk. I had like a question more related with your specific research. I wondered if during your research you encountered any specific cross-African pattern in how the introduction of mining impacted the social structures of African populations. In general, by this I mean like some instance of either maybe proto-syndicalism or if there were already existent structures which adapted in the African populations which adapted to the introduction of mining to cope with it under a social point of view. I don't know if my question is clear.
Thanks, Luca. Look, this is perhaps one of the most widely debated and researched topics in the historiography. Broadly speaking, I would answer and say it makes sense to look at this in a regional, from a regional perspective. That mining has a very long history on the continent, longer than most other parts of the world, but it changed a great deal with the beginnings of colonial rule and the introduction of industrial mining in many places. But in some places, the industrial companies are forced to adapt to the norms and culture of the place they were operating in. And in other places, those norms and cultures were smashed and recast in events of great force and violence.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Very evocative answer there. Thank you, Duncan. We've got a question from Panache. Over to you.
Hi, Duncan. Nice to meet you again. My question is more with regards to the career development towards being an independent researcher. I'm currently finishing up my research master, and I'm wondering, it has the name research in it, but when can I call myself a bona fide researcher?
Hi again, Panache. I don't think you need a doctorate to be a historian. You need a certain amount of training and familiarity with research methods and the material and particular subjects. Certainly, from my I found in my experience, having a PhD is useful for a credential point of view, but not everyone who has a PhD is a great historian, and not all great historians have PhDs. In terms of career development, it's what I found most useful, or perhaps even more useful than having a doctorate. It's simply a wide professional network that people know what kind of research I do. They know what particular things I have knowledge and skills about, and no one is going to come to me and say, oh, we're an organization, we're interested in the history of the Ganges Delta, or we're interested in the history of 14th century Japan. You're a historian, can you help us? Because the answer to that is no, of course. I wouldn't even know where to start. But if you can establish a particular profile for yourself and an area of specialism, something that you could do that distinguishes yourself from others, and build a portfolio of projects, that's what has worked for me, and I hope would work for others too.
Thanks, Duncan. We've got literally, if we could summarize this in a sort of 30 seconds, a minute, final point. So there are lots of people listening to this that have expert knowledge, maybe publications, books, all this years of experience about particular subjects. What is the crucial steps, the action points they should take today to get along the steps to this kind of career path you're talking about? This is the bit that people don't you need experience to sort of understand it. How would you describe what to do next? Thank you, Duncan.
Well, look, I got started with this because somebody approached me for an opportunity. You know, they wanted a specific piece of work done that was related to my research, but I very rarely get approached by things. A lot of the times I approach other people, and I get used to being ignored. I get used to people saying no, not interested. I get used to people saying, "Why on earth are you contacting us?" But yeah, I get used to pitching projects to people, projects I think will be interesting, projects I think I would like to do that fit with the kind of knowledge and experience that I have, and that's a different way of working than kind of previous jobs I did where I was assigned tasks to do and then completed them. And that, for me, was the biggest transition. That's becoming more independent in seeking out work opportunities.
Thank you, Duncan. Yes, you've got to cross the Rubicon into being very proactive and developing a thick skin and trying and trying and trying again and doing purposefully and learning from experience, even if it is a unsuccessful one in a particular case. Look, we've got, thanks so much for your time, everyone. This is a great session. I knew Duncan would be wonderful, and a lot of people have got great ideas out of it. Do stay in touch for future sessions. We've got several more coming up. We're already booking them into next month. And it remains to thank Duncan, Dr. Duncan Money, for his time. And we'll see you all soon. Bye for now.
Thanks very much, everyone.